My property survey was crystal clear. The fence had been there for 7 years, properly permitted and installed. But that didn't stop my HOA board member from hiring someone to move it while I was away on a business trip. Little did she know, my security cameras caught everything. And this was just the beginning of her downfall. Not only was I about to expose years of HOA corruption, but I was about to learn that in my quiet, suburban community of Riverside Meadows, property lines weren't the only boundaries being crossed. If you've ever dealt with an unreasonable HOA board member, you might want to stick around for this one. This is the story of how one power-hungry Karen's attempt to steal 8 feet of my property ended up exposing a years-long scheme that had been terrorizing our entire neighborhood. I'm Mark Anderson, and until last spring, I was just another homeowner in Riverside Meadows, a suburban development about 30 minutes outside of Portland. I'd moved here 7 years ago, attracted by the well-maintained properties and the promise of a quiet life away from the city's chaos. As a software engineer working remotely, I'd invested considerable time and money into creating my perfect home office setup, complete with a peaceful backyard view. My background in software engineering had taught me the importance of documentation and attention to detail. When I first bought the house, I'd made sure everything was properly surveyed, permitted, and recorded. The previous owners had installed a basic chain-link fence, but I'd replaced it with a gorgeous cedar privacy fence that complemented the neighborhood's aesthetic. I'd even gotten written approval from the HOA board before installation. The fence project wasn't just about privacy. It was about creating an outdoor workspace where I could take calls and work during nice weather. I'd added a covered patio area, complete with weatherproof outlets and a mesh Wi-Fi extender. My neighbors often commented on how professionally it had all been done. And I'd even helped Dave and Susan Wilson, the elderly couple next door, with their own backyard tech setup. Patricia Reynolds, or Pat, as she insisted on being called, had moved into the house behind mine about 2 years ago. From day one, she'd made it her mission to become the neighborhood's self-appointed property standards enforcer. Within months, she'd worked her way onto the HOA board, and that's when the real problem started. At first, it was just little things. She'd send out violation notices for garbage bins being left out an hour too long or leaves not being raked quickly enough. After falling, most neighbors just complied to avoid confrontation, but I noticed how she seemed to target certain homeowners more than others. I had my first run-in with Pat during last year's HOA board election. She'd campaigned for stricter property regulations, including a controversial proposal to standardize all backyard fences. When I spoke up at the meeting about the impracticality and cost of such a measure, she'd given me a look that should have warned me I'd made an enemy. The morning everything changed, I was in Seattle for a 3-day tech conference. I'd set up my security cameras to send motion alerts to my phone, another habit from my IT background that would prove invaluable. Around 10 a.m., I received multiple alerts showing unusual activity in my backyard. Opening the feed, I watched in disbelief as a crew of workers began dismantling sections of my fence while Pat stood supervising, clipboard in hand. I immediately tried calling Pat, but it went straight to voicemail. I called Barbara Mitchell, the HOA president, but her assistant said she was in meetings all day. Frantically, I started recording the security feed and called Dave Wilson next. Door, asking if he could check what was happening. Dave's voice was shaking when he called back. "Mark, they're moving your fence back about 8 feet. Pat's telling everyone your fence encroaches on HOA common property and has to be relocated. She's got some official-looking papers, but something doesn't feel right about this." I felt my blood pressure rising as I watched them methodically, moving my fence, destroying parts of my carefully planned outdoor workspace in the process. But what really caught my attention was how Pat kept glancing nervously at her phone, as if waiting for something or making sure someone wouldn't return early. The alert from my security system changed everything. Within minutes of watching those workers start dismantling my fence, I was on the phone with Emily Chen, my neighbor whose property had a clear view of the entire scene. Emily's voice was tight with concern as she confirmed my worst fears. Pat Reynolds wasn't just supervising the fence removal. She was actively directing workers to dig new post holes well within what I knew was my property line. I immediately started downloading every bit of footage my cameras had captured. Years of working in data security had taught me the value of redundant backups, and something about this situation felt decidedly wrong. As I saved the third video file, my phone lit up with a text from John Cooper, who lived 3 doors down. "Are you seeing this? Pat's got some official-looking surveyor with her, but I've never seen a legitimate surveyor work that fast or take so few measurements." From my hotel room in Seattle, I felt helpless watching the destruction of my property in real time. But I wasn't about to let this go unanswered. I pulled up my home's documentation on my laptop, the original survey from my purchase, the HOA approval for the fence installation, and most importantly, the city permits that clearly showed the proper boundary lines. That's when I noticed something odd in the security footage. Pat kept referencing a document in a blue folder, showing it to the workers whenever they hesitated, but she never let them hold it or examine it closely. Even more suspicious, she appeared to be taking photos of my backyard office setup, paying particular attention to my tech equipment and outdoor workspace. I called Tim Harrison, the city property inspector, who had approved my original fence installation. Tim's response sent a chill down my spine. "Mark, I haven't issued any permits for fence modification on your street in months, and I certainly haven't authorized any work on your property." As I watched more footage, I caught Pat making a phone call. Thanks to my high-quality security system, the audio was clear enough to hear fragments of her conversation. "Yes, it's perfect. Plenty of space for the planned expansion. He's out of town until Thursday. No documentation problems. I have everything we need right here." Dave Wilson, my elderly neighbor, had been quietly observing the whole scene. He sent me a text that would later prove crucial. "Mark, I just overheard Pat telling someone on the phone about property values and development opportunities. Something about how removing obstacles would make everything easier. I recorded it on my phone. Linda taught me how to do that last week. By noon, my fence had been moved significantly inward, destroying part of my outdoor workspace and damaging several expensive pieces of equipment in the process. Pat seemed particularly pleased with herself, strutting around my yard with her clipboard, taking more photos and measurements. I decided it was time to call Rachel Martinez, a real estate attorney my colleague had recommended months ago when I'd first noticed some questionable HOA practices. Rachel picked up on the second ring, and as I explained the situation, her typical professional demeanor shifted to one of intense interest. "Mark, stop all communication with Pat or the HOA immediately," Rachel advised. "I want you to send me every piece of documentation you have. Property surveys, permits, HOA approvals, and especially that security footage. Something bigger is happening here. This isn't the first case I've heard about involving suspicious property line disputes in your area." While Rachel began her initial review, I received an unexpected call from Frank Thompson, a former HOA board member who had abruptly resigned 3 months ago. His voice was hushed, almost nervous. "Mark, I saw what happened today. There's something you need to know about Pat Reynolds and some recent property acquisitions in the neighborhood. Can we meet somewhere private when you return?" By late afternoon, Pat had finished supervising the fence relocation. The security footage showed her placing something in my mailbox before leaving, an official-looking notice that Dave Wilson retrieved and photographed for me. The document claimed my fence had been moved due to critical property line corrections and included an invoice for $3,800 for the emergency remediation work. But Pat had made a crucial mistake. In her haste to complete the work while I was away, she'd left behind a crumpled piece of paper that Susan Wilson discovered while checking on my property. It was a preliminary drawing of what appeared to be development plans, with my newly reduced property lines sketched in and a larger structure mapped out across several adjacent lots. As I sat in my hotel room that evening, pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. The targeted HOA violations, the suspicious property line disputes, Pat's endless photographs of certain properties. It all pointed to something far more calculated than simple HOA overreach. My phone buzzed with a message from Emily Chen. "Mark, I think you should know that Pat did something similar to the Thompsons last month. They sold their house right after, and I've seen her meeting with some developers at the coffee shop. I started recording dates and times after the third meeting."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That night I barely slept. Instead, I compiled a detailed timeline of events, cross-referenced security footage timestamps, and began mapping out every interaction I'd had with Pat since she'd joined the HOA board. Each detail, viewed in isolation, might have seemed like typical HOA bureaucracy, but together, they painted a picture of systematic harassment and property manipulation. What I didn't know then was that Pat's actions that day would unravel a scheme involving fraudulent surveys, forged documents, and a network of corrupt officials that stretched far beyond our quiet neighborhood. The moved fence was just the beginning, a single thread that, when pulled, would unravel years of calculated deception and reveal how one power-hungry HOA board member had been working to reshape our entire community for her own gain. My security. Cameras had caught more than just Pat moving my fence. They had captured the opening moves of a game she'd been playing for months. But this game was about to change, and Pat was about to learn that she had chosen the wrong property owner to target. The next morning, back in Portland, I pulled into my driveway at dawn, my anger mounting as I saw the full extent of the damage to my property. The once straight line of my cedar fence now cut an awkward angle through my carefully designed outdoor workspace. The mesh Wi-Fi extender had been damaged, and several weatherproof outlets had been carelessly ripped from their mounts during the fence relocation. Rachel Martinez, my attorney, arrived shortly after, her expression grim as she surveyed the scene. She pulled out a laser measuring device and began taking precise measurements, comparing them to my original property documents. "This is even worse than the photos showed," she muttered, making detailed notes on her tablet. "They've moved the vents nearly 9 feet in at the deepest point." As we documented the damage, Dave Wilson came over with something interesting. "I've been going through old photos of the neighborhood," he said, spreading several dated pictures on my outdoor table. "Look at this. Pat's been using the same contractor for property adjustments all over the development." The photos showed similar fence modifications at 4 other properties, all of which had been sold within months of the changes. While Rachel continued her measurements, I noticed Pat Reynolds emerging from her house. She froze momentarily upon seeing us, then quickly recovered, marching toward my property with that familiar clipboard in hand. "Mr. Anderson," she called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "I see you've returned. I trust you found our notice about the property line corrections." Rachel stepped forward, introducing herself as my legal counsel. Pat's confident demeanor faltered slightly, but she pressed on, pulling out her blue folder. "Everything was done according to HOA bylaws," she insisted, attempting to hand me a stack of papers. "These surveys clearly show the encroachment." Rachel intercepted the documents, her eyes narrowing as she examined them. "Interesting," she said quietly. "These survey stamps appear to be from Carlton and Associates, but they closed their business 2 years ago. Would you care to explain that, Mrs. Reynolds?" Pat's face flushed. I'll have to check with our records department, she stammered, quickly retreating toward her house. But as she turned to leave, a business card slipped from her folder, one that would later prove crucial to our case. It was from a company called Summit Property Acquisitions. That afternoon, Frank Thompson, the former HOA board member, met us at Rachel's office. His hands shook slightly as he pulled out a thick manila envelope. "I've been gathering evidence. Since I resigned," he explained. "Pat's not just moving fences. She's part of a larger scheme to devalue properties and force sales." Frank's documents revealed a disturbing pattern. Summit Property Acquisitions had been quietly buying up properties in our development, often after mysterious property line disputes had caused owners to sell at reduced prices. Pat, it seemed, had been working as their inside agent, using her HOA position to target specific properties that fit into Summit's development plans. Just then, my phone buzzed with a notification. Emily Chen had sent me security footage from her camera showing Pat meeting with two men in suits the previous week. They were examining maps of the neighborhood, and Emily's directional microphone had picked up fragments of their conversation about acquisition targets and pressure points. Rachel was examining the fake surveys when her assistant rushed in with news. "We found Kevin Brooks," she announced. Kevin was the legitimate surveyor who had done my original property assessment. "He's willing to testify that his signature was forged on these new documents." As we dug deeper, John Cooper arrived with more evidence. His wife worked at the county records office, and she'd noticed something odd, a pattern of property line amendments being filed just before homes were sold to Summit. All the paperwork had been processed by the same clerk who happened to be Pat's cousin. The pieces were falling into place, but we needed more. Rachel suggested we hire a private investigator to track Pat's connections to Summit. "We need to prove she's not just an overzealous HOA board member," she explained. "This is organized fraud." That evening, as I was reviewing more security footage, I noticed something in the background of one clip. While the workers were moving my fence, Pat had been taking photos of more than just my property. She was photographing my neighbors' yards as well, particularly those with home offices or recent improvements. A quick check of recent HOA meetings minutes revealed that Pat had been pushing for new property use restrictions that would effectively prohibit home offices and outdoor workspaces. The timing wasn't coincidental. Summit's development plans, as we would later discover, called for a commercial office complex in our neighborhood. Mike Sullivan, the fence contractor who had installed my original fence, stopped by to assess the damage. His face darkened as he examined the relocated posts. "This wasn't done to code," he declared, pointing out several safety violations. "And these aren't even proper survey markers they used. They're decorative stakes painted to look official." The next morning, Linda Warren, the HOA secretary, contacted me privately. She had been keeping her own records of Pat's suspicious activities, including copies of emails that had mysteriously disappeared from the HOA's official accounts. "She's been deleting evidence," Linda whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "But I've backed everything up. Rachel advised me to install additional security cameras and document every interaction with Pat or anyone associated with the HOA. Based on similar cases I've handled," she explained, "they'll likely escalate their pressure once they realize you're fighting back. We need to be ready." She was right. That afternoon, I received a certified letter from the HOA demanding immediate payment for the fence relocation, threatening liens and legal action if I failed to comply within 72 hours. The letter was signed by Barbara Mitchell, the HOA president. But Rachel quickly noticed something off about the signature. A call to Barbara's office revealed she had been on vacation for the past week. She knew nothing about the fence relocation or the demand letter. Her signature had been forged, adding another layer to Pat's growing list of fraudulent actions. The real breakthrough in understanding the depth of Pat's scheme came from an unexpected source. Tim Harrison, the city property inspector, had been doing some digging of his own. He arrived at my house early one morning, clutching a thick folder and looking genuinely disturbed. "You need to see this," he said, spreading documents across my kitchen counter. "I've been tracking building permits and property line adjustments across 3 neighborhoods. There's a pattern here that goes beyond just your fence." Tim's documents revealed something startling. Every property that had been subjected to emergency corrections or boundary adjustments under Pat's supervision followed a specific geographical pattern. When mapped out, these properties formed a perfect corridor for a proposed commercial development, one that hadn't been made public yet. While we were reviewing the documents, Emily Chen called with urgent news. Her security cameras had captured Pat and 2 men in suits measuring several properties in the middle of the night. "They're doing it again," Emily whispered. "They're planning their next target." The footage showed them placing small markers at specific points, the same type of markers that had appeared on my property just days before my fence was moved. Rachel Martinez arrived with a court reporter and a professional surveyor in tow. As they began documenting the precise measurements of my property line, an unexpected visitor approached. Chris Peterson, a former contractor who had worked with Pat on previous property adjustments. He looked nervous, but determined. "I can't sleep at night anymore," Chris confessed, his voice shaking. "But we did. It wasn't just moving fences. We were systematically forcing people out of their homes." He explained how Pat had coordinated with Summit Property Acquisitions to identify properties that were crucial to their development plans. The strategy was always the same: create property disputes, impose hefty fines, and pressure owners until they had no choice but to sell. George Phillips, the HOA treasurer, reached out through a secure email account. He had discovered suspicious financial transactions, large consulting fees being paid to shell companies that all traced back to Summit. "The money trail is clear," he wrote. "Pat's been getting kickbacks for every property she helps acquire." Belinda Warren provided access to hidden HOA meeting recordings where Pat had secretly discussed acquisition strategies with Summit representatives. The recordings revealed a calculated plan to use HOA regulations as weapons against specific homeowners, find violations, create problems, make their lives difficult, the Summit executive had instructed. Everyone has a breaking point. Rachel's investigative team uncovered more. The company that had moved my fence, Precision Property Solutions, didn't actually exist. It was a front company created by Summit, used exclusively for their property manipulation schemes. The workers weren't licensed contractors. They were hired hands paid to follow Pat's instructions without questioning the legality of their actions. Dave Wilson's daughter, a real estate agent, provided another crucial piece of evidence. She had access to property sale records showing how homes in our neighborhood had been sold significantly below market value, but only after experiencing property line disputes or receiving multiple HOA violations. The pattern was undeniable. Our investigation revealed that Pat had been meticulously selecting her targets. Homes with absent owners, elderly residents, or people likely to avoid confrontation were marked as prime acquisition opportunities in Summit's internal documents. My property had been targeted specifically because of my frequent business trips and my valuable corner lot position. Barbara Mitchell, upon returning from vacation, was horrified to learn how her position as HOA president had been used to legitimize Pat's actions. She provided emails showing how Pat had been intercepting and altering official HOA communications, ensuring that complaints about her activities never reached the full board. Kevin Brooks, the legitimate surveyor, analyzed the forged documents Pat had been using. He discovered that they weren't just simple forgeries. They were part of a sophisticated system of altered property records that had been quietly filed with multiple agencies. The scheme had been designed to create confusion and make it difficult for homeowners to prove their original property lines. Frank Thompson came forward with more evidence, including recordings of HOA meetings where Pat had systematically blocked attempts to investigate homeowner complaints. He had resigned from the board when he realized the extent of the corruption, but not before documenting numerous instances of Pat's manipulation of HOA rules. As we pieced together the evidence, a disturbing timeline emerged. Pat's appointment to the HOA board hadn't been coincidental. It was part of Summit's larger strategy. They had placed her in the position specifically to facilitate their property acquisition scheme. The fake surveys, forged documents, and targeted harassment were all tools in a carefully orchestrated plan to reshape our entire neighborhood. John Cooper's wife discovered something else in the county records. A series of rezoning applications filed months before Pat began targeting specific properties. Summit had been planning this development for over a year, using Pat to clear their path property by property. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Pat's assistant, feeling guilty about her role in the scheme, provided access to a private email account. The emails contained detailed correspondence between Pat and Summit executives, discussing everything from target properties to payout structures. They had even maintained spreadsheets tracking their success rate in forcing homeowners to sell. Rachel Martinez sat with me late one evening, reviewing all the evidence we had gathered. "This isn't just about your fence anymore," she said gravely. "We've uncovered a systematic conspiracy to defraud homeowners of their property rights. The question is, how do we want to proceed?" The answer came the next morning when 3 more homeowners reported suspicious activity around their properties. Pat was accelerating her plans, perhaps sensing that her scheme was about to be exposed. It was time to act, but we needed to be strategic. One wrong move could give them time to destroy evidence or worse, find ways to retaliate against those who had helped us. Rachel began preparing legal documents while I organized our evidence into a clear, undeniable narrative of corruption and fraud. We were about to expose not just Pat's actions, but an entire network of property fraud that had been operating unchecked in our community. The moved fence that had started it all was about to become the thread that unraveled their entire operation. Armed with mounting evidence, Rachel Martinez orchestrated a methodical plan to build our case. We needed to move carefully. One misstep could alert Pat and Summit to our investigation. Rachel brought in forensic accountant Daniel Webster to trace the complex web of financial transactions between Summit Property Acquisitions, the HOA, and Pat's personal accounts. Daniel's findings were staggering. Hidden within layers of shell companies and consulting fees, he uncovered a pattern of payments that coincided perfectly with each property adjustment in our neighborhood. For every home that sold to Summit after experiencing property line disputes, a substantial consulting fee would appear in an offshore account linked to Pat. Emily Chen proved to be an unexpected asset to our investigation. As a cybersecurity specialist, she helped analyze Pat's digital footprint. Her expertise revealed a hidden email server Pat had been using to communicate with Summit executives. The emails contained detailed strategies for targeting specific properties, including psychological profiles of homeowners they deemed susceptible to pressure. One evening, while reviewing security footage, we caught a break. Pat's laptop screen was briefly visible through her home office window, reflected in her glass cabinet. Emily's enhancement of the image revealed she was accessing a database called Operation Redevelopment. With this lead, our tech team began working to access the database legally through discovery requests. Mike Sullivan, my original fence contractor, connected us with other contractors who had refused to participate in Pat's scheme. Their testimonies painted a picture of systematic intimidation. Those who wouldn't cooperate found themselves blacklisted from HOA projects across multiple communities. Some had even received threatening phone calls, warning them to mind their own business. Linda Warren's meticulous record-keeping proved invaluable. She had maintained a separate set of HOA meeting minutes, documenting discussions that mysteriously never appeared in the official records. These included instances where Pat had pushed through property rule changes without proper board approval, using forged signatures and manipulated voting records. The investigation took an unexpected turn. When Frank Thompson introduced us to Sarah Martinez, no relation to Rachel, a former Summit employee who had quit over ethical concerns. Sarah provided internal memos detailing Summit's community acquisition strategy, which explicitly outlined using HOA regulations as weapons to force property sales. Our breakthrough came from Tom Harrison, the city inspector's brother, who worked in the county records office. He discovered that Pat had been using her connection to a county clerk to backdate property line amendments. This meant that even when homeowners produced their original surveys, Pat could claim the boundaries had been officially corrected months or years earlier. Rachel advised setting up a secure evidence room in her office. The walls soon filled with maps, timelines, and connection diagrams. Red strings linked property sales to HOA violations, showing the clear pattern of Pat's targeted harassment campaign. Each string represented a family pressured out of their home through manipulated property disputes. Kevin Brooks, the surveyor, brought forward more disturbing information. He had found his digital signature had been stolen and used on numerous fraudulent surveys. The technical sophistication suggested Pat wasn't working alone. Someone with significant resources was helping forge these documents. Barbara Mitchell, still reeling from discovering how her authority had been abused, provided access to the HOA's complete financial records. The audit revealed systematic discrepancies in the HOA's enforcement fund. Money that should have been used for community improvements had instead been funneled into private accounts through inflated contractor invoices. George Phillips, the HOA treasurer, worked with Daniel Webster to trace these fraudulent payments. They uncovered a complex scheme where fines collected from targeted homeowners were being laundered through fake maintenance contracts, ultimately flowing back to Summit and their conspirators. Chris Peterson's contractor connections led us to other workers who had been involved in Pat's property adjustments. Many were willing to testify about how they were given explicit instructions to ignore homeowner protests and proceed with fence relocations, often under threat of legal action. Dave Wilson's security cameras had captured something crucial: late-night meetings between Pat and Summit executives in the community clubhouse. The footage showed them reviewing large blueprints and discussing what appeared to be development plans. Most importantly, it caught them openly discussing how to pressure specific homeowners into selling. John Cooper discovered that his next-door neighbor had received the same type of property line dispute notice that preceded my fence relocation. Working quickly, we helped them install security cameras and document everything. Within days, we caught Pat conducting her familiar pattern of late-night property measurements and marker placements. Rachel's legal team grew as the case expanded. They began preparing injunctions not just against Pat and Summit, but against the entire network of conspirators we had uncovered. The evidence was mounting, but Rachel warned that our opponents would fight back hard once they realized the extent of our investigation. Tim Harrison brought forward city planning documents that showed Summit had already submitted preliminary development proposals dated months before they began targeting properties in our neighborhood. This proved they had been planning their takeover long before Pat joined the HOA board. The scope of Pat's scheme became clear when Sarah Martinez provided access to Summit's internal project timeline. Our neighborhood was just one piece of a larger development plan. They had been systematically targeting communities, installing cooperative HOA members, and using property disputes to force sales across the entire region. Just as we were consolidating our evidence, Emily Chen's security system caught Pat shredding documents in her garage late one night. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to show she was destroying what appeared to be property records and correspondence. It was time to act. We couldn't risk losing any more evidence. Rachel Martinez prepared to file our case, but not before ensuring every piece of evidence was properly documented and secured. We had uncovered not just a case of HOA overreach, but a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been systematically defrauding homeowners of their property rights. The question now wasn't just about stopping Pat, it was about exposing the entire network and ensuring justice for every family that had been forced from their home. The pressure campaign against me began within hours of Rachel filing our initial court documents. Around midnight, I received an urgent text from Emily Chen. "Mark, someone's tampering with your outdoor security cameras." Through her remote monitoring system, we watched as two figures in dark clothing systematically attempted to disable each camera, unaware that we had installed hidden backup units the week before. My phone rang at 3 a.m. Dave Wilson's voice was tense. "There's a suspicious van parked outside your house. They've been sitting there for hours, taking photos." I contacted the police, but by the time they arrived, the van had disappeared. The officer took note of the license plate Dave had managed to photograph, promising to investigate. The next morning, I discovered my mailbox stuffed with violation notices, each one cited increasingly absurd infractions. Unapproved shade of white trim, excessive bird activity in yard, and non-regulation grass height variance. The fines totaled over $12,000, all requiring payment within 48 hours under threat of property liens. Rachel Martinez arrived at my house just as a group of workers from County Environmental Services attempted to enter my backyard. Their paperwork, claiming to investigate hazardous landscape conditions, looked official until Rachel pointed out that they had misspelled the county administrator's name. The workers quickly departed, but not before we documented everything. Throughout the day, a steady stream of official-looking vehicles drove past my house. Each one stopped briefly, its occupants taking photos or making notes. Emily's directional microphone picked up one conversation: "Keep the pressure on. Anderson needs to understand what he's up against." By evening, Pat Reynolds had escalated her tactics. She organized an emergency HOA meeting in her driveway, just within earshot of my home office. Through the open windows, I could hear her rallying neighbors against me, claiming I was destroying property values and threatening the community's future development. Linda Warren, attending the meeting undercover, recorded Pat making veiled threats about how uncooperative homeowners often experienced unfortunate accidents or mysterious property damage. The recording captured nervous murmurs from the crowd, as Pat detailed how previous troublemakers had faced endless legal challenges until they chose to leave. Just before midnight, John Cooper called with disturbing news. His wife had overheard Pat at the grocery store speaking to someone about making examples of homeowners who resisted property adjustments. The conversation mentioned bringing in specialists to handle stubborn situations. The intimidation tactics grew more sophisticated. My internet service began experiencing mysterious outages. The power to my outdoor security system would occasionally cut out. Each time, utility companies found signs of tampering, but could never quite prove who was responsible. Summit's involvement became more overt. Working quickly, We helped them install security cameras and document everything. Within days, we caught Pat conducting her familiar pattern of late-night property measurements and marker placements. Rachel's legal team grew as the case expanded. They began preparing injunctions not just against Pat and Summit, but against the entire network of conspirators we had uncovered. The evidence was mounting, but Rachel warned that our opponents would fight back hard once they realized the extent of our investigation. Tim Harrison brought forward city planning documents that showed Summit had already submitted preliminary development proposals, dated months before they began targeting properties in our neighborhood. This proved they had been planning their takeover long before Pat joined the HOA board. The scope of Pat's scheme became clear when Sarah Martinez provided access to Summit's internal project timeline. Our neighborhood was just one piece of a larger development plan. They had been systematically targeting communities, installing cooperative HOA members, and using property disputes to force sales across the entire region. Just as we were consolidating our evidence, Emily Chen's security system caught Pat shredding documents in her garage late one night. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to show she was destroying what appeared to be property records and correspondence. It was time to act. We couldn't risk losing any more evidence. Rachel Martinez prepared to file our case, but not before ensuring every piece of evidence was properly documented and secured. We had uncovered not just a case of HOA overreach, but a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been systematically defrauding homeowners of their property rights. The question now wasn't just about stopping Pat, it was about exposing the entire network and ensuring justice for every family that had been forced from their home. The pressure campaign against me began within hours of Rachel filing our initial court documents. Around midnight, I received an urgent text from Emily Chen. "Mark, someone's tampering with your outdoor security cameras." Through her remote monitoring system, we watched as two figures in dark clothing systematically attempted to disable each camera, unaware that we had installed hidden backup units the week before. My phone rang at 3 a.m. Dave Wilson's voice was tense. "There's a suspicious van parked outside your house. They've been sitting there for hours taking photos." I contacted the police, but by the time they arrived, the van had disappeared. The officer took note of the license plate Dave had managed to photograph, promising to investigate. The next morning, I discovered my mailbox stuffed with violation notices. Each one cited increasingly absurd infractions. Unapproved shade of white trim, excessive bird activity in yard, and non-regulation grass height variance. The fines totaled over $12,000, all requiring payment within 48 hours under threat of property liens. Rachel Martinez arrived at my house just as a group of workers from County Environmental Services attempted to enter my backyard. Their paperwork, claiming to investigate hazardous landscape conditions, looked official until Rachel pointed out that they had misspelled the county administrator's name. The workers quickly departed, but not before we documented everything. Throughout the day, a steady stream of official-looking vehicles drove past my house. Each one stopped briefly, its occupants taking photos or making notes. Emily's directional microphone picked up one conversation. "Keep the pressure on. Anderson needs to understand what he's up against." By evening, Pat Reynolds had escalated her tactics. She organized an emergency HOA meeting in her driveway, just within earshot of my home office. Through the open windows, I could hear her, rallying neighbors against me, claiming I was destroying property values and threatening the community's future development. Linda Warren, attending the meeting undercover, recorded Pat making veiled threats about how uncooperative homeowners often experienced unfortunate accidents or mysterious property damage. The recording captured nervous murmurs from the crowd, as Pat detailed how previous troublemakers had faced endless legal challenges until they chose to leave. Just before midnight, John Cooper called with disturbing news. His wife had overheard Pat at the grocery store speaking to someone about making examples of homeowners who resisted property adjustments. The conversation mentioned bringing in specialists to handle stubborn situations. The intimidation tactics grew more sophisticated. My internet service began experiencing mysterious outages. The power to my outdoor security system would occasionally cut out. Each time, utility companies found signs of tampering, but could never quite prove who was responsible. Summit's involvement became more overt. Their legal team sent a letter claiming my property encroached on land they had pre-existing development rights to. The document threatened immediate legal action unless I agreed to sell my property at their generous offer of 40% below market value. Frank Thompson discovered that Summit had hired a private investigation firm to dig into my background. They were looking for anything they could use against me. Financial troubles, personal scandals, professional misconduct. Their thorough investigation only revealed my clean record, but the invasion of privacy was unsettling. Barbara Mitchell, the HOA president, received anonymous threats, warning her to stay out of the situation. Photos of her family going about their daily routines appeared in her mailbox, a clear message that someone was watching. Rather than cowering, Barbara brought the evidence straight to Rachel. Kevin Brooks, the surveyor, reported that someone had broken into his office. While nothing was stolen, his files had been thoroughly searched, focusing particularly on records related to our neighborhood's property lines. The police found professional lockpicks at the scene. The psychological warfare intensified. Unmarked envelopes appeared on my doorstep containing photos of my house taken at different times of day. Some showed me working in my home office. Others captured me on my phone in what I thought were private moments. Each photo carried the same message: "Is this worth it?" Chris Peterson received similar warnings. His contracting business suddenly lost several major clients. Anonymous reviews appeared online questioning his work quality. His suppliers began reporting mysterious credit issues that delayed his material deliveries. Emily Chen's cybersecurity expertise uncovered a coordinated digital campaign against me. Fake social media accounts spread rumors about my character. Professional networking sites showed mysterious negative recommendations. My work email was flooded with phishing attempts and malware. Sarah Martinez, the former Summit employee, faced her own challenges. Her new employer received an anonymous dossier claiming she had stolen confidential documents from Summit. Although false, the accusations forced her to hire legal representation to protect her career. Through it all, Rachel Martinez remained steadfast. She documented every incident, building an additional case for witness intimidation and harassment. "They're getting desperate," she observed. "Each attempt to silence us only proves how much they have to hide." The pressure campaign reached its peak when a concerned citizen reported suspected code violations at my house. City inspectors arrived, clearly uncomfortable with their orders to find problems. Their report, stating they found no violations, mysteriously disappeared from city records the next day. Tim Harrison discovered that similar tactics had been used in other neighborhoods where Summit had development interests. A pattern emerged of targeted harassment, mysterious accidents, and escalating pressure until homeowners finally gave in and sold their properties. As the intimidation continued, our support network grew stronger. Neighbors began organizing neighborhood watches. Security cameras appeared on more houses. Every attempt to isolate and pressure me instead brought the community closer together in resistance. Each act of intimidation added to our evidence pile. Rachel's office maintained a detailed log, cross-referencing each incident with similar tactics used in other Summit development projects. The pattern was clear. This was their standard playbook for dealing with resistance to their schemes. By the end of the week, Pat's pressure campaign had backfired spectacularly. Instead of intimidating me into silence. She had given us a wealth of evidence showing the lengths Summit would go to force their development plans through. Each threat, each act of vandalism, each attempt at intimidation was carefully documented, building an even stronger case against them. Support for our cause emerged from unexpected places. Alice Winters, an elderly resident who lived 3 blocks away, arrived at my door one morning clutching a shoebox full of letters. "I've been keeping these since 2019, she said, her hands trembling. Inside were dozens of threatening notices from Pat, each one increasingly aggressive, all targeting Alice's prized rose garden that apparently stood in the way of Summit's planned parking structure. The community center became our unofficial headquarters. Rachel Martinez had suggested we hold an informal gathering to see if other residents had similar stories. We expected maybe a dozen people. Over 50 showed up. Tom Rodriguez, a retired police officer, described how his wheelchair ramp had been declared non-compliant shortly after Pat joined the HOA board. The timing coincided perfectly with Summit's interest in his corner lot. Mary Jang, who ran a successful home-based daycare, revealed how Pat had suddenly started citing her for noise violations, despite operating legally for 8 years. The citations began exactly 2 weeks after Summit filed preliminary plans that showed Mary's property as a future commercial space. During the meeting, Greg Foster, a local real estate agent, shared something interesting. He had noticed a pattern of properties being systematically undervalued in our neighborhood. The low valuations always seemed to happen right after homeowners received multiple HOA violations or faced property line disputes. Our breakthrough came from Samantha Lee, a junior clerk at the county records office. She had noticed irregularities in property line amendment filings, but had been afraid to speak up. Summit's influence reached deep into local government, and whistleblowers had a habit of finding themselves unemployed. James Morrison, a former Summit contractor, provided crucial testimony about their methods. They called it property optimization. He explained, first, identify key parcels, then find or create HOA violations, apply pressure until the owner sells. They had it down to a science. The community's response transformed from fear to action. Rebecca Torres, a graphic designer, created a secure website where residents could document and share their experiences with Pat and Summit. Within days, we had hundreds of submissions, each one fitting the same pattern of harassment and intimidation. Dr. William Chen, Emily's father and a respected civil engineer, volunteered to review all the disputed property lines. His analysis revealed that Pat's corrections consistently benefited Summit's development plans, often violating basic surveying principles in the process. Local journalist Diana Howard began quietly investigating similar cases in neighboring communities. She uncovered a pattern. Wherever Summit showed development interest, controversial HOA board members would appear, followed by waves of property disputes and forced sales. Our alliance grew stronger when Peter McCarthy, a former Summit executive, reached out through Rachel. He had left the company over ethical concerns and was willing to testify about their systematic approach to acquiring properties through manipulated HOA regulations. The community's unity had an unexpected effect. Summit's usual tactics of isolation and intimidation failed when faced with collective resistance. When they sent threatening letters to one homeowner, copies would immediately be shared with the group. Their ability to pressure individuals crumbled in the face of widespread support. Lisa Patel, who owned the local coffee shop, offered her business as a safe meeting space. Her security cameras captured multiple instances of Summit representatives conducting suspicious meetings, including one where Pat received what appeared to be an envelope of cash. Robert Jennings, our state representative's aide, began taking an interest in the case. He had received similar complaints from other districts. and saw our situation as a potential catalyst for HOA reform legislation. The tide really turned when Helen Martinez, a retired judge, moved into the neighborhood. She quickly recognized the legal irregularities in Pat's actions and became a valuable advisor to our cause. Her presence gave many residents the confidence to come forward with their stories. Through these connections, we discovered that Summit's scheme extended beyond just property acquisition. They had been manipulating local zoning laws, influencing property assessments, and coordinating with specific real estate agents to control property values in targeted areas. The evidence room in Rachel's office expanded to include 3 whiteboards, tracking connections between Summit executives, local officials, and suspicious property transactions. Each new testimony added another piece to the puzzle, revealing the true scope of their operation. Carol Weber, who worked at the city planning office, provided copies of Summit's original development proposals. They showed how each disputed property fit into their larger plans, proving that Pat's property line corrections were part of a calculated strategy. Our community meetings grew larger, now including residents from neighboring developments who recognized similar patterns in their areas. Summit's scheme, it seemed, had affected hundreds of families across multiple communities. The support network evolved into an organized resistance. When Summit's representatives appeared in the neighborhood, they found themselves followed by residents with cameras. Their every move was documented, their conversations recorded, their tactics exposed. Through social media and local news coverage, our story began attracting attention from other communities facing similar issues. Law firms specializing in property rights reached out, offering to join our legal team. Housing advocacy groups provided additional resources and support. Each new ally brought their own expertise and resources to our cause. What had started as one homeowner's fight against a moved fence had grown into a movement challenging systematic property fraud. Summit had finally met an obstacle they couldn't simply pressure or buy their way past. An informed, united community determined to protect their homes. The decisive evidence came from an unexpected source on a rainy Tuesday morning. Michael Callahan, a janitor at Summit's regional office, contacted Rachel with information that would change everything. For months, he had been quietly photographing documents left in executives' waste bins, suspicious of the conversations he overheard. While cleaning late at night, the photos revealed internal memos detailing Summit's community acquisition strategy. One document explicitly named Pat Reynolds as their point person in our neighborhood, outlining her compensation structure for each property she helped acquire through HOA pressure tactics. Another memo discussed the importance of maintaining plausible deniability while orchestrating property disputes. Rachel immediately brought in forensic document expert Dr. Sarah Montgomery to authenticate the evidence. As Dr. Montgomery examined the papers, she noticed something crucial. Watermarks on several documents matched those used by Summit's legal department, confirming their authenticity. Meanwhile, Emily Chen's cybersecurity team made another breakthrough. They discovered a hidden server containing emails between Pat and Summit executives, discussing specific strategies for each property they targeted. The emails revealed a sophisticated scoring system, ranking homeowners based on their perceived vulnerability to pressure tactics. During this time, George Phillips, the HOA treasurer, had been conducting his own investigation into the association's finances. He uncovered a series of suspicious transactions, consulting fees paid to shell companies that traced back to Pat's personal accounts. Each payment coincided with a successful property acquisition by Summit. The pressure on Pat began to show. Security cameras caught her making late-night visits to a storage facility on the outskirts of town. Working with local authorities, Rachel obtained a warrant to search the unit. Inside, they found boxes of original property documents that had been reported lost by the county records office. Victoria Ramirez, a former Summit legal intern, came forward with crucial testimony. She had witnessed meetings where executives openly discussed using HOA regulations as weapons, specifically selecting board members who would cooperate with their schemes. Her detailed notes included names, dates, and specific strategies discussed. Our case strengthened further when Kevin Brooks completed his analysis of the surveying documents Pat had used. He discovered that the fraudulent surveys followed a pattern, each error conveniently aligned with Summit's development plans, creating a perfect footprint for their proposed commercial complex. The investigation took an unexpected turn when David Chen, Emily's brother and a data analyst, noticed something in Summit's property acquisition records. The company had been using an algorithm to identify potential targets, focusing on properties owned by elderly residents, single parents, or people likely to avoid legal confrontation. As pressure mounted, cracks began appearing in Summit's facade. Junior executives, sensing the coming storm, started reaching out to Rachel with information. Each new testimony added detail to our understanding of how deeply the corruption ran. Through Linda Warren's connections at City Hall, we obtained records of closed-door meetings between Summit executives and local officials. The transcripts revealed discussions about fast-tracking zoning changes specifically to benefit Summit's development plans, with Pat's HOA actions serving as groundwork for these changes. Frank Thompson's persistence paid off when he located Maria Gonzalez, a former Summit property assessor who had quit over ethical concerns. She provided documentation showing how the company manipulated property valuations using HOA violations and property disputes to artificially depress home values before making purchase offers. Our evidence room now contained a comprehensive timeline of Summit's activities in the region. Every property line dispute, every questionable HOA fine, every forced sale fit into their larger strategy. Pat's role as their enforcement arm became undeniable. Robert Jennings, working with state investigators, uncovered connections between Summit and several shell companies used to hide their property acquisitions. The complex web of financial transactions suggested a level of planning that went far beyond simple real estate development. The final piece fell into place when Chris Peterson found his old work orders from Summit projects. The document showed a clear pattern of intentional property line adjustments, each one precisely calculated to create disputes that would pressure homeowners into selling. Rachel Martinez organized all the evidence into a compelling narrative. The story it told was clear. Summit had orchestrated a systematic campaign to acquire properties through manipulation of HOA regulations, with Pat Reynolds serving as their willing enforcer. Barbara Mitchell discovered additional evidence. In the HOA's archived emails, messages that Pat had attempted to delete revealed direct coordination with Summit executives, including discussions about targeting specific homeowners who refused to sell. Tim Harrison's review of city permits exposed how Summit had expedited approvals for their development plans, even before acquiring the necessary properties, showing their confidence in Pat's ability to force homeowners out. The evidence was overwhelming, but Rachel insisted on thoroughness. Each document was authenticated, each testimony corroborated, each connection verified. We weren't just building a case against Pat. We were exposing an entire system of property fraud that had operated unchecked for years. As we prepared to move forward with legal action, our evidence room told the story of systematic corruption, carefully documented and irrefutably proven. Summit's carefully constructed scheme, with Pat as its local enforcer, was about to be exposed to public scrutiny. Rachel Martinez orchestrated our legal strategy with military precision. Our first move wasn't a direct lawsuit against Pat or Summit, but rather an emergency injunction hearing before Judge Sandra Thompson. The courtroom, buzzed with tension as homeowners filled every available seat, each one carrying their own story of harassment and manipulation. Summit's legal team arrived in force, led by corporate attorney Maxwell Richardson. Their confidence wavered visibly when they saw the volume of evidence boxes Rachel's team had brought. As the hearing began, Judge Thompson leaned forward, her expression serious, as Rachel outlined the scope of our case. Stephen Walsh, Summit's lead attorney, attempted to dismiss our claims as simple property disputes blown out of proportion. His smirk faded as Rachel methodically presented Michael Callahan's photographs of internal Summit documents, each one authenticated by Dr. Montgomery's forensic analysis. The turning point came when Victoria Ramirez took the stand. Her testimony about Summit's internal meetings was damning. She described in detail how executives had celebrated Pat's creative enforcement of HOA regulations, explicitly discussing how property line disputes could be manufactured to force sales. During cross-examination, Summit's attorneys tried to discredit Victoria, suggesting she was a disgruntled former employee. Rachel calmly produced emails between Summit executives praising Victoria's work, dated just days before she quit over ethical concerns. The attempted character assassination backfired spectacularly. Maria Gonzalez's testimony about Summit's property valuation manipulation drew audible gasps from the courtroom. She presented spreadsheets showing how property values were systematically undervalued following HOA violations, creating a clear pattern of coordinated devaluation. Kevin Brooks, the surveyor, used digital mapping to demonstrate how Pat's property line corrections precisely matched Summit's development plans. His technical expertise made the fraud undeniable, showing how each boundary adjustment served Summit's larger agenda. When Chris Peterson presented his collection of work orders, Summit's defense began to crumble. The documents showed a clear progression of targeted properties, each one modified according to Summit's specifications under Pat's supervision. Pat Reynolds herself was called to testify. Her usual confidence cracked under Rachel's methodical questioning. When presented with emails discussing her commission structure for forced sales, Pat's attempts to explain them as routine consulting fees fell apart. George Phillips's financial analysis proved devastating. He traced millions in suspicious payments through Summit's network of shell companies, each transaction corresponding to a successful property acquisition following HOA disputes. Emily Chen's technical evidence sealed Summit's fate. The recovered server data showed years of coordinated efforts to target specific properties, complete with psychological profiles of homeowners they planned to pressure into selling. Judge Thompson's expression grew increasingly stern as the evidence mounted. When Summit's attorneys attempted to argue that the property line adjustments were legally authorized, Rachel produced Barbara Mitchell's testimony about forged HOA documents and falsified board approvals. The final piece fell into place when Chris Peterson found his old work orders from Summit projects. The documents showed a clear pattern of intentional property line adjustments, each one precisely calculated to create disputes that would pressure homeowners into selling. Rachel Martinez organized all the evidence into a compelling narrative. The story it told was clear. Summit had orchestrated a systematic campaign to acquire properties through manipulation of HOA regulations, with Pat Reynolds serving as their willing enforcer. Barbara Mitchell discovered additional evidence. In the HOA's archived emails, messages that Pat had attempted to delete revealed direct coordination with Summit executives, including discussions about targeting specific homeowners who refused to sell. Tim Harrison's review of city permits exposed how Summit had expedited approvals for their development plans, even before acquiring the necessary properties, showing their confidence in Pat's ability to force homeowners out. The evidence was overwhelming, but Rachel insisted on thoroughness. Each document was authenticated, each testimony corroborated, each connection verified. We weren't just building a case against Pat. We were exposing an entire system of property fraud that had operated, unchecked for years. As we prepared to move forward with legal action, our evidence room told the story of systematic corruption, carefully documented and irrefutably proven. Summit's carefully constructed scheme, with Pat as its local enforcer, was about to be exposed to public scrutiny. Rachel Martinez orchestrated our legal strategy with military precision. Our first move wasn't a direct lawsuit against Pat or Summit, but rather an emergency injunction hearing before Judge Sandra Thompson. The courtroom buzzed with tension as homeowners filled every available seat, each one carrying their own story of harassment and manipulation. Summit's legal team arrived in force, led by corporate attorney Maxwell Richardson. Their confidence wavered visibly when they saw the volume of evidence boxes Rachel's team had brought. As the hearing began, Judge Thompson leaned forward, her expression serious, as Rachel outlined the scope of our case. Stephen Walsh, Summit's lead attorney, attempted to dismiss our claims as simple property disputes blown out of proportion. His smirk faded as Rachel methodically presented Michael Callahan's photographs of internal Summit documents, each one authenticated by Dr. Montgomery's forensic analysis. The turning point came when Victoria Ramirez took the stand. Her testimony about Summit's internal meetings was damning. She described in detail how executives had celebrated Pat's creative enforcement of HOA regulations, explicitly discussing how property line disputes could be manufactured to force sales. During cross-examination, Summit's attorneys tried to discredit Victoria, suggesting she was a disgruntled former employee. Rachel calmly produced emails between Summit executives praising Victoria's work, dated just days before she quit over ethical concerns. The attempted character assassination backfired spectacularly. Maria Gonzalez's testimony about Summit's property valuation manipulation drew audible gasps from the courtroom. She presented spreadsheets showing how property values were systematically undervalued following HOA violations, creating a clear pattern of coordinated devaluation. Kevin Brooks, the surveyor, used digital mapping to demonstrate how Pat's property line corrections precisely matched Summit's development plans. His technical expertise made the fraud undeniable, showing how each boundary adjustment served Summit's larger agenda. When Chris Peterson presented his collection of work orders, Summit's defense began to crumble. The documents showed a clear progression of targeted properties, each one modified according to Summit's specifications under Pat's supervision. Pat Reynolds herself was called to testify. Her usual confidence cracked under Rachel's methodical questioning. When presented with emails discussing her commission structure for forced sales, Pat's attempts to explain them as routine consulting fees fell apart. George Phillips's financial analysis proved devastating. He traced millions in suspicious payments through Summit's network of shell companies, each transaction corresponding to a successful property acquisition following HOA disputes. Emily Chen's technical evidence sealed Summit's fate. The recovered server data showed years of coordinated efforts to target specific properties, complete with psychological profiles of homeowners they planned to pressure into selling. Judge Thompson's expression grew increasingly stern as the evidence mounted. When Summit's attorneys attempted to argue that the property line adjustments were legally authorized, Rachel produced Barbara Mitchell's testimony about forged HOA documents and falsified board approvals. David Chen's analysis of Summit's targeting algorithm revealed their systematic approach to identifying vulnerable homeowners. The data showed how they specifically targeted elderly residents, single parents, and others they deemed unlikely to mount legal challenges. Frank Thompson's documentation of similar schemes in other neighborhoods demonstrated that our situation wasn't isolated. The pattern of abuse stretched across multiple communities, all following the same playbook of manufactured disputes and forced sales. Linda Warren's recordings of HOA meetings proved that Pat had actively worked to suppress homeowner complaints, using her position to protect Summit's interests while undermining legitimate concerns about property rights. Tim Harrison's testimony about manipulated building permits showed how Summit had prepared for their development long before acquiring properties, expecting Pat's enforcement actions to clear their path. As the hearing progressed, Summit's legal team grew increasingly desperate. They attempted to have evidence dismissed on technical grounds, only to have Rachel produce additional documentation supporting each claim. Robert Jennings presented his findings about Summit's shell companies, revealing a complex network designed to hide their true ownership of acquired properties. The financial web demonstrated the premeditated nature of their scheme. Michael Callahan's cross-examination proved particularly powerful. His simple, honest testimony about discovering discarded documents resonated with the judge, especially when he described his growing concern about the conversations he overheard. Dr. Montgomery's forensic analysis shut down Summit's attempts to question the authenticity of the evidence. Her detailed examination of paper types, ink compositions, and digital signatures provided irrefutable proof of Summit's involvement. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Thompson reviewed the final pieces of evidence. The systematic nature of Summit's scheme, supported by hundreds of documents and dozens of witnesses, painted a clear picture of coordinated fraud. Rachel's closing argument was masterful, weaving together the technical evidence with the human impact of Summit and Pat's actions. She described how families had been forced from their homes through manufactured disputes, all to serve Summit's development plans. Summit's closing arguments felt hollow in comparison. Their attempts to characterize the situation as routine, property disputes couldn't stand against the mountain of evidence showing coordinated fraud and manipulation. As Judge Thompson prepared to rule on our injunction request, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Homeowners who had suffered under Pat's enforcement actions held their breath, hoping for the first step toward justice. Judge Thompson's ruling exceeded our most optimistic expectations. She not only granted the emergency injunction halting all of Summit's development activities, but also ordered an immediate freeze on all property transfers in our neighborhood pending a full investigation. Her voice carried controlled anger as she cited overwhelming evidence of systematic fraud and abuse of HOA authority. The aftermath was immediate and far-reaching. State investigators descended on Summit's regional office, armed with warrants to seize documents and electronic records. Pat Reynolds arrived home to find federal agents executing a search warrant, methodically boxing up her files and computers. The sight of her being escorted from her house, no longer in control, marked a profound shift in our community's power dynamic. Local news crews gathered outside the courthouse as Rachel Martinez addressed the media. She outlined how our case had uncovered not just isolated incidents of HOA abuse, but a sophisticated criminal enterprise designed to strip homeowners of their property rights. The story quickly caught national attention, with major networks picking up the story of how one moved fence had exposed a multi-state property fraud scheme. Summit's corporate response came swiftly but ineffectively. They issued a press release announcing an internal investigation and claiming Pat had acted without corporate authorization. This narrative crumbled when Victoria Ramirez provided recordings of board meetings where Summit executives explicitly discussed their strategy of using HOA regulations as weapons against homeowners. Within days, similar cases began emerging across the country. Law firms in multiple states filed class action lawsuits against Summit, citing our evidence as the basis for their claims. Property owners who had lost their homes to suspicious HOA actions came forward with stories that matched our documented pattern perfectly. The professional consequences for those involved were severe. Maxwell Richardson and his legal team faced ethics investigations for their role in concealing Summit's activities. Pat's real estate license was suspended pending a regulatory review. Summit's stock price plummeted as investors reacted to the scandal and potential liability. Barbara Mitchell called an emergency HOA meeting, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. The community gathered not in fear, but in determination to rebuild their association. Linda Warren presented a comprehensive reform proposal, including new transparency requirements and protections against abuse of HOA authority. City officials, sensing the changing political winds, launched their own investigation into questionable development approvals. Several planning department employees were placed on administrative leave as evidence emerged of their cooperation. With Summit's scheme, the mayor announced a task force to review all recent property developments for similar patterns of abuse. Robert Jennings worked with state legislators to draft new HOA regulations, using our case as a model for reform. The proposed legislation would require independent oversight of property line disputes and create new protections against retaliatory enforcement actions. Emily Chen's cybersecurity team continued analyzing the seized data, uncovering connections to similar schemes in other states. Their findings suggested that Summit's approach had been refined through years of practice, with our neighborhood representing just one instance of a much larger pattern of fraud. The human impact of our victory became clear as former residents began exploring legal options to reclaim their properties. Sarah Thompson, an elderly widow who had sold her home under pressure from Pat, filed suit to void the sale. Her case became a template for others seeking to reverse Summit's fraudulent acquisitions. Michael Callahan's role as a whistleblower attracted particular attention. His simple act of preserving discarded documents had helped expose years of corporate misconduct. Advocacy groups cited his example in pushing for stronger protections for employees who expose corporate wrongdoing. Frank Thompson organized a community support network for homeowners navigating the legal aftermath. Weekly meetings provided updates on the investigation and connected residents with legal resources. The gatherings became a symbol of community, resilience, and mutual support. David Chen's analysis of Summit's targeting algorithm led to broader investigations of discriminatory housing practices. Civil rights organizations began examining how technology was being used to identify and exploit vulnerable homeowners across the country. The professional surveying community, led by Kevin Brooks, established new protocols for detecting and preventing fraudulent property line modifications. His experience with Pat's scheme helped create guidelines for identifying suspicious pattern of boundary adjustments. Maria Gonzalez's testimony about property valuation manipulation sparked a regulatory review of real estate assessment practices. State agencies began implementing new requirements for documenting and justifying significant changes in property valuations. George Phillips worked with forensic accountants to create a comprehensive record of Summit's financial transactions. Their analysis revealed how apparently legitimate HOA fees had been used to fund a systematic campaign of property acquisition through intimidation. Tim Harrison's evidence about manipulated building permits led to a complete overhaul of the city's approval process. New requirements for public notice and independent review were implemented to prevent future abuse of the system. Dr. Montgomery's forensic analysis became a case study in detecting document fraud. Her methodical approach to authenticating evidence provided a template for investigating similar schemes in other communities. The courtroom victory marked not just the end of Summit's scheme, but the beginning of a larger movement for HOA reform and homeowner protection. What had started as one homeowner's stand against a moved fence had evolved into a nationwide examination of property rights and corporate accountability. The transformation of our community went far beyond just legal victories. Working with Barbara Mitchell, we established a completely new HOA governance structure that prioritized transparency and homeowner protection. Every board meeting was now live-streamed, with recordings archived and accessible to all residents. Decisions about property violations required multiple independent reviews, effectively preventing any single person from wielding HOA regulations as a weapon. Summit's corporate empire began to unravel as investigations spread to other states. Federal prosecutors uncovered similar schemes in dozens of communities, each following the same playbook of manipulated property lines and manufactured HOA disputes. The company's executives faced mounting legal challenges as shareholders filed their own lawsuits over the concealed fraud. Rachel Martinez's law firm established a dedicated division to handle cases of HOA abuse, using our success as a model for helping other communities fight back against corporate development schemes. They created detailed guides for identifying warning signs of systematic property fraud, sharing these resources freely with homeowners across the country. Emily Chen developed specialized software to detect patterns of suspicious HOA enforcement actions. Her program analyzed violation records, property sales, and development plans to identify potential cases of coordinated harassment. Several state attorneys general adopted her system as part of their consumer protection efforts. The ripple effects reached the real estate industry itself. Professional associations implemented new ethical guidelines for dealing with HOA disputes, requiring thorough documentation of property line changes and independent verification of violation claims. The reforms made it significantly harder for developers to manipulate local regulations for their benefit. Local journalism experienced a renaissance as our story inspired deeper investigations into property development practices. Diana Howard's coverage expanded into a series examining how corporations used seemingly legitimate community organizations to advance their interests at residents' expense. Her reporting won several awards and sparked similar investigations nationwide. Michael Callahan's whistleblowing inspired others to come forward. Former employees of various development companies shared stories of similar schemes, each one adding to the growing body of evidence showing how widespread these practices had become. Their testimonies strengthened calls for stronger corporate oversight and whistleblower protections. The recovered documents from Pat's office revealed connections to other development projects across the state. Each investigation uncovered the same pattern: HOA board members installed as corporate agents, systematic harassment of targeted homeowners, and coordinated efforts to force property sales at deflated prices. Frank Thompson's community support network evolved into a formal advocacy organization, providing resources and guidance to homeowners facing similar situations. They developed training programs to help residents understand their rights and recognize signs of corporate manipulation of HOA regulations. Kevin Brooks worked with professional surveying organizations to establish new certification requirements specifically focused on detecting fraudulent property line modifications. His experience with Summit's scheme helped create industry-wide standards for documenting and verifying boundary changes. George Phillips's financial analysis became a template for investigating suspicious HOA activities. His methods for tracking money through networks of shell companies proved invaluable in exposing similar schemes in other communities. State regulators adopted his techniques as part of their standard audit procedures. The City Planning Department underwent a complete reorganization, implementing new safeguards against development fraud. Every proposed project now required extensive public notification and community input, with special attention paid to any changes affecting existing residential properties. David Chen's data analysis revealed patterns of discriminatory enforcement that extended far beyond our neighborhood. His findings led to broader investigations of how development companies targeted specific demographics for displacement, often using HOA regulations as their primary tool. Victoria Ramirez's testimony about Summit's internal practices sparked a congressional inquiry into corporate abuse of community organizations. Her detailed accounts of how companies manipulated local governance structures led to proposals for new federal oversight of development practices. Linda Warren's documentation of HOA meeting manipulations helped establish new standards for organizational transparency. Her system of parallel record-keeping became a model for other communities seeking to prevent abuse of administrative procedures. Robert Jennings worked with state legislators to craft comprehensive HOA reform laws. The new regulations included mandatory external audits, strict limits on emergency actions, and clear procedures for challenging board decisions. Most importantly, they created strong protections against retaliatory enforcement. Sarah Thompson's successful lawsuit to reclaim her property established important legal precedents. Courts began recognizing patterns of HOA harassment as a form of constructive eviction, making it easier for other displaced homeowners to challenge fraudulent property transfers. Maria Gonzalez's expertise in property valuation helped expose how development companies manipulated market prices through coordinated HOA actions. Her analysis showed how artificial devaluation through selective enforcement created opportunities for predatory acquisition strategies. Tim Harrison's evidence about permit manipulation led to criminal charges against several former city employees. Their cooperation with investigators revealed complex networks of payoffs and favors that had facilitated Summit schemes for years. Dr. Montgomery's forensic work expanded beyond document analysis to include digital evidence of corporate misconduct. Her methods for authenticating electronic records proved crucial in tracking communications between development companies and their HOA agents. The community's collective experience became a powerful catalyst for change, demonstrating how organized resistance could effectively challenge corporate abuse of local institutions. What began as a dispute over a moved fence had exposed fundamental flaws in how residential development was regulated and overseen. As our story spread, other communities began implementing similar reforms, creating networks of mutual support and shared resources for protecting homeowner rights. The movement grew beyond just fighting corporate development schemes to address broader issues of community governance and property rights protection. 1 year after Pat Reynolds' attempt to move my fence, our community gathered for the dedication of the new Homeowners' Rights Center established in what was once Summit's local office building. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very space once used to plan property schemes now served as a resource center for preventing such abuse. The transformation of our neighborhood had exceeded all expectations. Where once stood abandoned homes targeted by Summit's acquisition plans, new families had moved in, drawn by our community's reputation for strong homeowner protections and transparent governance. The damaged properties had been restored, and our reformed HOA had become a model for communities nationwide. Rachel Martinez had parlayed our success into a nationwide legal advocacy network. Law firms across the country coordinated their efforts to identify and challenge suspicious development practices, sharing resources and expertise to help other communities resist corporate takeover attempts. Her office regularly hosted training sessions for attorneys learning to recognize patterns of systematic property fraud. Pat Reynolds herself faced the consequences of her actions. The criminal trial revealed even more details about Summit's operations, with Pat's testimony exposing how deeply the corruption had penetrated local government. Her detailed account of Summit's methods, offered in exchange for a reduced sentence, provided invaluable insights for preventing similar schemes. Emily Chen's security innovations had revolutionized community protection. Her integrated system of property monitoring and data analysis had been adopted by homeowner associations nationwide, creating an early warning network for detecting coordinated attempts at property manipulation. The technology she developed had essentially made Summit's old playbook obsolete. Frank Thompson's advocacy organization had grown into a powerful force for homeowner rights. With chapters in multiple states, they provided immediate support to communities facing suspicious development pressure. Their rapid response teams could quickly mobilize resources and expertise to help homeowners resist corporate intimidation tactics. Michael Callahan's role in exposing Summit's fraud led to enhanced whistleblower protections in the property development industry. His courage in preserving evidence inspired others to come forward, creating a cascade of revelations about corporate misconduct in community development projects across the country. The legislative reforms sparked by our case had far-reaching effects. Robert Jennings worked with lawmakers to create the Homeowner Protection Act, establishing strict oversight of property development practices and creating new legal tools for challenging abusive HOA actions. The law's provisions for preserving evidence and protecting whistleblowers made it significantly harder for companies to conceal fraudulent schemes. Barbara Mitchell's transformed HOA became a case study in effective community governance. Her implementation of transparent decision-making processes and strong homeowner protections demonstrated how local organizations could serve their communities while resisting corporate influence. Other HOAs regularly sent observers to learn from our example. Kevin Brooks developed comprehensive training programs for property surveyors, teaching them to recognize and document suspicious patterns of boundary adjustments. His work helped create a network of professionals actively working to prevent the kind of systematic fraud Summit had perpetrated. The recovered documents from Summit's offices revealed connections to similar schemes across the country. Each investigation uncovered the same pattern of corporate infiltration of local organizations, leading to a nationwide reckoning with how development companies manipulated community governance structures. Linda Warren's meticulous documentation methods became standard practice for HOA operations. Her system of parallel record-keeping and independent verification made it virtually impossible for single individuals to manipulate official records or abuse administrative procedures. Victoria Ramirez's testimony about corporate practices led to fundamental changes in how development companies operated. New regulations required extensive public disclosure of development plans and prohibited the kind of secret agreements Summit had used to control local officials. Sarah Thompson's successful property recovery case established legal precedents that helped hundreds of other displaced homeowners challenge fraudulent sales. Courts began recognizing patterns of coordinated harassment as grounds for invalidating property transfers, making it easier for victims to reclaim their homes. The physical transformation of our neighborhood reflected deeper changes in community dynamics. The restored properties and rebuilt fences represented more than just structural repairs. They symbolized our collective recovery from corporate predation and our commitment to protecting homeowner rights. David Chen's analytical methods had been adopted by consumer protection agencies nationwide. His techniques for identifying discriminatory enforcement patterns helped expose similar schemes in other communities, preventing countless families from losing their homes to corporate development schemes. Maria Gonzalez's work on property valuation fraud led to new standards for real estate assessment. Her insights into how companies manipulated property values through coordinated HOA actions helped create safeguards against artificial devaluation schemes. Tim Harrison's evidence about permit manipulation resulted in comprehensive reforms of development approval processes. New requirements for public notification and independent review made it significantly harder for companies to push through questionable projects without proper scrutiny. Dr. Montgomery's forensic techniques became standard tools for investigating property fraud. Her methods for authenticating documents and tracing corporate communications helped expose similar schemes across the country, contributing to a broader movement for development industry reform. As I stood in my backyard, looking at the properly restored fence line, I reflected on how our fight against Pattern Summit had transformed not just our community, but the entire landscape of property rights protection. What began as one homeowner's stand against corporate bullying had evolved into a nationwide movement for reform and accountability. The sight of children playing in yards that Summit had once marked for development, of neighbors gathering without fear of selective enforcement, of community meetings marked by transparency and mutual respect, these were the real victories. We had not just stopped one company's fraudulent scheme, we had created a model for how communities could protect themselves against corporate predation. Our story had become a beacon of hope for other communities facing similar challenges, proving that organized resistance and careful documentation could overcome even the most sophisticated schemes of corporate manipulation. The moved fence that started it all now stood as a reminder that every act of resistance, no matter how small, had the potential to spark lasting change. Up next, we've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.